So let's go then to the next model that we would like to discuss, which is about pre-existing debt, or in other words, actually about debt overhang. So if you remember perhaps from your bachelor's courses, debt overhang basically means an inability to finance new projects because of an over-reliance of past debt, of legacy debt. So we'll have a look at that, how that works in our model, our moral hazard model or workhorse model that we discussed before. So this is essentially about the agency costs that are associated to bankruptcy. So what happens to a firm when it's really over indebted and is near bankruptcy? Can it still, even though it's in bad weather, can it still carry out projects which might be positive NPV and which one would like to execute? So an example that I already mentioned last week is from last spring, actually, is the Dutch retail company HEMA, which is a large retail chain in the Netherlands, also in some other European countries. So this retail chain is fairly old, but it was bought about 2 years ago by an entrepreneur with a lot of capital, Marcel Boekhorn. But he inherited essentially a firm which already had a large indebtedness. So there was a lot of debt compared to equity in this firm. Now, last spring, of course, was the Corona spring, the lockdown. The shops remained open, but of course, there was less business for them, and it turned out to be very hard actually to meet debt requirements. And in the end, due to the difficulties, the cash flow difficulties that the firm encountered in its relations with the original debt holders, this firm came to a decision in which ultimately the debt holders basically took over and essentially rejected the plans that this investor, this entrepreneur had, was also an equity owner, and instead sort of took over equity, restructured the debt to make it sort of more bearable, at least in the short term, and went their own course. So debt overhang again is, if a firm has a large amount of debt, a large debt burden, it might not be able to finance some new investments, even though these investments, when looked at in isolation, might be profitable, so positive NPV, and even might have been carried out by a new entrepreneur with a clean slate. So let's look at what that means. So we have a model again. Let's assume for convenience that the entrepreneur in this model has no cash of their own, so they cannot contribute to their own investment, but they do have a profitable investment project. And actually, it's going to be an investment project which, on a standalone basis, would be possible to fund with outside funding, even without any assets. So even though A equals 0, if A bar, if you remember the threshold value for assets that you need to carry out this project on a standalone basis is negative, which can actually happen, then what one might expect this project to be funded and executed, and the positive NPV to be realized. But now what we're going to add here is that there is this pre-existing debt. So I'm going to call this pre-existing debt, we'll give it a name, it's called D, capital D. Now, if the project is carried out, of course, this NPV is realized, but if the project is not carried out, let's just assume the firm ends, it's terminated. So that means if this project is not carried out, there is actually no recovery at all for original debt holders. Firm value is 0, so they lose everything. In particular, they lose this amount of debt, capital D. And also, of course, there's no benefit for the agent because there's no project and no additional outcome of this project. So we're going to assume that if all the required payments to, on the one hand, the entrepreneur, the B over delta P, to make sure that the project is incentive compatible, so that the entrepreneur is going to put in the effort, is made, and also that if the project is successful, the original debt holders, the owners of this capital D, are completely paid off, we're going to assume that if that's done, then not enough money remains to make sure that new outside investors are going to be able to break even. So the expected value after paying off both the entrepreneur and the old debt holders is too low to make sure that new investors will break even if they invest into this project. So that means you cannot finance this project and at the same time fully pay off the original investors. So new investors will not come on board because they, in expectation, they will not be breaking even, let alone make a profit. So this is basically the situation of debt overhang. So we have this financeable project on a standalone basis, but as a result of this pre-existing debt, the debt overhang, this project cannot be carried out. So what might be solutions to debt overhang? Well, put yourself in the position of this this initial debt holder, this initial investor. Well, if this project is not carried out, they get nothing, right? So no project, no money. Well, if this initial investor has additional funds, they might realize, well, I'd rather have something rather than nothing. So one solution, if the original debt holder still has money, is to say, I'm going to forgive the debt, get rid of the original D, but I'm going to invest a new I in this profitable new project. I know I cannot get all the rents from this project because I have to make sure that the entrepreneur gets his or her B over delta P, because I need to make sure that the project is incentive compatible, that the entrepreneur is going to put in the required effort, otherwise this project is not going to be profitable at all. But in this case, I do realize a positive payoff because we assume that the expected pledgeable income without this capital E was sufficient to remunerate the investor. So the same original investor, when investing the amount I for this new project themselves, and promising at least B over delta P to the entrepreneur so that there's incentive compatibility on that side, is going to actually make a positive profit, which is better than getting nothing. So that's one solution. So if this original investor just gets rid of the original debt and says, well, let's start with a clean slate. I'm going to invest and then I get something rather than nothing. I do have to pay something to the entrepreneur. Well, it's just me. There is no competition here. There's just a single initial investor. So I can make sure that the entrepreneur's rents are driven down to the minimum required level necessary for them to put in the effort. So I promise exactly B over delta P, exactly the required amount to the entrepreneur. So the entrepreneur will agree to that because they get something rather than nothing. They get the expected value of B over delta P, or PH, probability of success, times B over delta P. And also the rest is going to this original investor, and they get the NPV basically of this project minus this amount that goes to this minimum amount that goes to the entrepreneur. So that's one solution to debt overhang. So if the original investor still has money, they might say, well, I see there's this profitable investment, I'm going to fund this new investment rather than that this firm go down the drain completely. Okay, then begs the question, so what happens if this original investor does not actually have this new money at its disposal, so it cannot fund the new project? So then we have a problem, clearly, because the initial investors, if there's no project, they get zero. New investors will not be willing to step in because they cannot break even, because if there is success, it's these old investors who are going to first make the first claim on the capital D that was still outstanding. So we have an inefficiency here. The project is not carried out. All people essentially are worse off. This solution here to this debt overhang problem might be a renegotiation with the initial investors. This renegotiation in these sort of examples, in these cases, is typically called a debt restructuring. So debt has to be restructured, so part of the debt will have to be given up. So there have to be some negotiations with the original debt holder to give up part of that claim, capital D, at least sufficient to make sure that outside investors can step in and finance the project while there's some amount remaining there for the entrepreneurs to have the incentives to do the work, so that the contract is incentive compatible. So how much or what part of the original debt capital D needs to be given up, needs to be forgiven? Well, so of course, there has to be some reduction in this claim of by the original investors. So the capital D needs to be lowered to some lower value, which we'll call little d. How much lower should that be? Well, it should be precisely so much lower, such that the new investors that will come in and fund the investment cost for the new project, can exactly break even after paying the B over delta P to the entrepreneur and the little d to the old investor. So this equation basically determines how large this remaining claim, little d, should be. So of course, in this case, the old investors get less than if nothing were wrong. So they get less than the expected pay of PH times capital D, but they do get more than zero, which would happen if this company just ends. The entrepreneur should accept this contract because they get something, they get the rents that they need to put in the effort, PH times V over delta P, and indeed new investors will, under this condition, be exactly willing to step in because they break even, and that's with competition, that's as much as they can actually hope for. So if this is done, if people can find a renegotiation here that succeeds, then indeed efficiency is restored because this profitable, incentive compatible project on its own is indeed carried out. Of course, this only works as long as this renegotiation business, this debt restructuring, succeeds. So sometimes that might be pretty difficult. So an example of why this might be difficult, well, this original debt might not be in the hands of just one company, which makes it easy to talk with one of them. It might be actually dispersed. So it might be many bondholders who each have a tiny fraction of this capital D, and you have to sort of somehow get some agreement with all of these, and that might be difficult just essentially because of coordination problems and perhaps free riding of some of these investors on others. So bankruptcy is one example where this might happen. Another example where this actually played a role was the EU bank and also country bailouts in the euro crisis basically from 2010 to 2014 more or less, where we had equity holders in particular, if you're looking at bank bailouts, bank equity holders negotiating with the state. So the equity holders knew, if there's no bailout, we lose everything. But if there is a bailout, we still have our equity and we want our full due. Of course, states who are going to bail out these banks would sort of not be so happy about this. They wanted the original equity holders to give in a bit, actually to settle for, to bear at least a large fraction of this loss, and also original bondholders actually. So in the end, actually, this resulted in various bailout laws that made sure that actually some of these original equity and debt holders were going to at least pay off some of the original debt in return for the bailout by the state. So this was necessary ultimately to overcome the debt overhang problem that loomed in many of these cases. Okay, so the next video will be about how can we boost pledgeable income in firms. So have a look at what the presence of multiple projects, how that can actually mitigate the agency problems that we saw in our fixed investment model.